Most of us group our airlines into three buckets: full-service carriers, ultra-low-cost carriers, and a middle group, which has become kind of hard to put a label on, but I'll still call them low-cost carriers or hybrid carriers. Companies distancing themselves from ultra-low-cost strategies seem to have been on the up and up lately, while our ultra-low-cost carriers, at least here in the United States, have been, well, yeah. But we have a total anomaly going on right now with Allegiant, and we're starting to see Breeze use their strategies as a way to help cement themselves in the industry here in the US. Today we'll use Allegiant and what we know about Breeze, since they aren't a publicly traded company, to prove that true ultra-low-cost carriers still have a place in this country. The single most important fact when looking at why Allegiant is so successful and how Breeze has seen early demand pop is their nonstop route competition percentage. Allegiant only has competition on about 14% of their routes, while Breeze is even lower at about 10%. This means that the airlines have nonstop monopolies on 86 and 90% of their routes respectively. The benefit of this is enormous. Opening up my microeconomics textbook from college for the first time, we can understand that Allegiant and Breeze can control their own fares more than other airlines in competition with one another, since these airlines are in what's called a market expansion pricing environment. This basically means that by lowering prices, they're attracting consumers who wouldn't have flown at all, instead of competition with airlines that are offering existing nonstop flights. Now they're competing with driving, connecting flights, which can be more expensive, and people just not going at all. The flip side of this is competitive pricing, which was one of the downfalls of Spirit Airlines, and many low-cost carriers struggling right now. In a competitive pricing environment, you can also lower your price to expand your customer base. However, your competitor can match your price, so now the same passenger has more than one option and can choose the other airline. So this means that your airline can have a lower load factor on a higher demand route because your competitor undercut your price. In the case of Frontier or Spirit Airlines competing on a route with a legacy carrier like Delta, it's even worse. One of the things that really hurt low-cost carriers was the introduction of the Basic Economy fare by the major airlines. Basic Economy is essentially a stripped-down ticket that lets airlines advertise very low fares while charging extra for things like seat selection, and this drives ancillary revenue. Sound familiar? This allowed airlines like Delta to compete directly for the same price-sensitive passengers that Spirit and Frontier depend on. The difference is that Delta also has higher margin products such as premium cabins and loyalty program revenue that Spirit and Frontier simply don't have the scale to match. That means that Delta can afford to be much more aggressive on price than an ultra-low-cost carrier can. As Breeze founder David Neeleman put it, Basic Economy was the thing that really hurt ultra-low-cost carriers on competitive routes. This is one of the main reasons why Breeze and Allegiant have focused so heavily on routes with little to no nonstop competition, allowing them to avoid these fare wars altogether and maintain far more control over their own pricing. Now, a second key advantage for Allegiant is their flexibility. Compared to Frontier, Allegiant owns the majority of their fleet outright. Out of the 123 aircraft they have operating at the time of recording, Allegiant only has 9 under leasing agreements, meaning that in Q1 of 2026, their total aircraft lease expense was about $7.5 million. Compare that to Frontier, whose entire 183 plane fleet is reliant on operating leasing contracts, costing them a massive $265 million in aircraft rent costs that same quarter. Instead of relying on these expensive monthly leases for brand new planes like Frontier does, Allegiant has historically bought slightly older used aircraft, and even with their more recent Boeing 737 MAX orders, their ownership cost remains incredibly low. Allegiant notes that purchasing the 737 MAX aligns with its low-cost business model through an ownership strategy that offers a longer, useful life for depreciation reasons. All 17 in-service Boeing 737 MAX 8200 aircraft in their fleet are currently fully owned. Rather than leasing, Allegiant funds acquisitions using debt such as pre-delivery deposit financing and aircraft secured credits, holding the physical asset directly on its balance sheet. Because Allegiant doesn't have the massive monthly lease payments hanging over their heads, they have some more freedom. If there isn't enough demand to fill a flight and make money, they simply don't fly it. Frontier, on the other hand, is stuck with high fixed costs on their leased A320neo family aircraft. They have to keep their planes in the air constantly just to cover the costs of rent, which forces them to fly on some lower demand routes which may have shaky revenue projections. So why not just shrink the fleet if they're having trouble finding demand to fill these seats? Well, they actually tried that. Frontier returned 24 A320neos to AerCap, but they ended up having to pay an early termination fee that totaled $139 million, over half of their entire leasing costs of Q1 in 2026 for the 183 planes. Now, Allegiant is still paying debt on their fleet, so they're still making payments somewhere. But there's a difference on the balance sheet between principal payments on an asset that you're eventually going to be able to own versus carrying operating lease liabilities. Holding the physical aircraft builds equity and collateralized borrowing power in the same way that a house does, providing an asset cushion that insulates them from demand downturns and unforeseen operational shocks. In early 2026, over 75% of Spirit's fleet was leased, leaving them with similar monthly costs as Frontier. When the massive Pratt & Whitney engine recalls happened, it forced Spirit to ground dozens of their brand new A320neos, but they were still legally on the hook for millions in rent for planes that weren't generating any revenue. That heavy lease burden, combined with zero revenue generation, absolutely pulverized their bottom line and burned through any cash they had left. And Frontier is currently very low on cash also. Because Allegiant owns their planes and controls their capacity, that extreme utilization pressure just isn't there. They maintain their operational and financial flexibility, and Frontier and Spirit just can't and couldn't match that. We see this play out with how Allegiant and Breeze use route cancellations to their advantage. Between January and April 2026 alone, Spirit slashed its flight offerings by 28%, and Frontier cut its schedule by 20% in that same period. These cuts were more defensive retreats from highly competitive markets where they were losing fare wars against major airlines, and Frontier and Spirit usually try and stick out routes rather than cut them entirely. On the flip side, because Allegiant and Breeze have that asset cushion and much lower fixed costs, they can afford to experiment with these underserved zero competition routes that we talked about at the beginning of the video. If a new monopoly route fails to draw enough passengers to operate it profitably, they simply drop it with little to no notice and park the plane at a cheap airport until they find a route to reschedule it on, and they won't bleed that operating cash to a lesser and worry about a return fee for an aircraft. And finally, there are a few things that Allegiant does different than almost every other airline that sets it apart. They protect their bottom line by diversifying beyond ticket sales and using an out and back routing structure. This structure brings crew back to their home bases every single night, eliminating the massive hotel and per diem expense that plagues legacy ultra low cost carrier models that run complex multi-leg pinwheel routes across several different cities. On top of that, Allegiant generates steady high-margin cash flow through fixed-fee charter contracts, pulling in over $18 million in Q1 of 2026 alone, plus nearly another $40 million in their co-branded credit cards, and another $42 million selling third-party rental cars, hotels, and travel insurance directly through their booking websites. While traditional ultra-low-cost carriers like Spirit and Frontier were left almost completely dependent on passenger fares, Allegiant has turned every flight into an opportunity for a much broader, highly profitable ecosystem, and we're starting to see many airlines copy that.